Hi, this is Paul. A lot of you send me things, and of course, I can't even watch or listen to everything that you send me. But Sam Ewing sent me this, and he was gracious enough to send a timestamp too about it. It's from Wisdom of Crowds. Is that a Substack or a website? I don't know. Seems sort of Substack like, and he said it really gets going around 30 minutes. Leah Labrescu Sargent is in there. I know her. I don't really know the others very well, but they're talking about autonomous living, and let's just give it a listen.
And I think you see this show up very strongly in the way that both our country and others are handling the question of euthanasia. That when you look at the reasons people seek medical aid in dying, in the US, we survey people in a few states on why are you doing this? And when we're passing the laws, the most commonly cited reasons are because of the pain in dying. That there comes a point where it's more important to prioritize ending the pain than continuing to live. That's the pitch. When you survey people, pain is not the most commonly cited reason for requesting lethal drugs. It's the fear of burdening your family. And I think that comes out of lives with a lot of practice, shifting all the ways in which you need others to people other than your family, other than your friends, handling it with money when you can, because it's too shameful and too intimate to bring to the people who love you. But there's a point at which you can't offload it.
Now, this was such an interesting point. Now, I just jumped in on the euthanasia point, but if you go back a little bit more, she's talking about the fact that part of what we do in our affluent, individualized culture is we pay strangers to do for us what historically family members would do for us, or kinship ties would do for us, or our village, the other people in our village would do for us. In other words, there was a non-cash web of interdependency that people relied upon in order to make life work. Because if you think about all of the things that go into living, especially before the Industrial Revolution, you had to make your own clothes. Houses had looms, spinning wheels. You had to butcher your own meat. You had to grow your own food. I mean, it's a tremendous amount of work to do all of that. And what human beings do with networks is we specialize. And so I have no idea how to make these blue shirts. I've got 5 of them. And I've got 5 of them because I found them on Amazon and they don't wrinkle and they were reasonably priced and they're pretty durable. I've had them for a few years and I'm a rut guy, so I like what I like. And so I wear the same dumb shirt all the time. And I can't make this shirt. Somebody made it somewhere and there weren't a lot of colors available, but blue was available. So I got 5 blue shirts. That's how the shirts came to be. I can't make the mic. I can't make any of these things. Now, on one hand, people get a little jittery when they worry about collapse, but nobody is autonomous. That's the title of this thing. I'll put the link below in it. And she's making that point. And then, when she turned to talk about, let's call it doctor-assisted suicide, because it's probably the most accurate way of talking about it. Euthanasia is a euphemism. Medical assistance in dying, that's pretty apt. But they want strangers to kill them. And it makes sense because you see this with elder care. There's an intimacy in caring for someone. And I've had conversations with people that have experienced this, caring for a loved one, and first they don't quite want to do it because it is so intimate, but then once they realize, in most cases they have to because there's no one else who's going to do it. Once they start, that intimacy develops and it can become a beautiful thing. And we sort of hold that off, and so we have usually really kind, low-wage immigrant workers who work in nursing homes caring for our elderly. And it's an interesting exchange. And there's a lot of conversation about that, especially in different ethnic communities in Sacramento. Well, let's let it go a little bit more.
And either you've had a life where you've been offering your needs to others, receiving theirs. It's been a bedrock of your friendship rather than viewed as an interruption of it. And then you do have practice for how to die surrounded by the people who love you, or you don't. Canada's at 5% of all deaths being doctor assisted suicide and rising. And they keep expanding it past actually terminal diseases, with the idea being, well, lots of things are burdensome. Lots of things cause you to need a lot from other people. And
It's like
wherever that's
mental
happening,
illness in like
and
teenagers.
anorexia and depression, which I think is the most shocking example because it implies you can call one of two suicide hotlines when you're depressed. You can call the suicide hotline that will tell you not to kill yourself, or you can call the suicide hotline that will send someone round the next day.
That's dark, actually. Wow.
Yeah. And so what's the defense against that? It's the understanding that there's no period of autonomy in your life. There are periods of varying intensity and varying willingness to share it with others. And I think we practice a lot making it small and private. And that even if it works for a time, it's going to fail you spectacularly at the end.
Okay, but Leah, I think that well, you've already sort of touched on this when you mentioned Eve and our origins kind of as creations of God and how that guides your work. But I think that the book is shot through with Christian assumptions. Let's not pretend here that you kind of empirically came to these conclusions because you were like assessing different factual things and you found out that we're all dependent on each other. I think that your sort of Christian anthropology of the person requires you to view human beings in a certain way.
That was so interesting how he navigated that. He basically says, well, I have this worldview. I don't recognize it as a worldview. It's just reality. That's your definition of a worldview. It's just reality. And if you're going to bring your Christian assumptions into the public square, well, foul. That's like dread Christian nationalism. And, but didn't you just bring your worldview and assumed it in the public square? That you can somehow base these morals on some fact that you have? Let's let it go a little bit more.
Like, there's no other conclusion that you can reach because you are a Christian and a committed one, and that guides you. And so I just wonder how much of this comes from a certain set of starting assumptions that maybe a lot of people aren't going to share. I mean, you say it's a feminist manifesto, but unless they share your Christian assumptions about the human person, they may not be able to walk with you all the way through.
I think
Now she's going to make an argument, but what's interesting is that, okay, so your book, I don't even know what book it is. I should probably just look it up. This must be it here. A Dignity of Dependence. Oh, Amazon, stop. A Feminist Manifesto, Catholic Ideas for a Secular World. So I didn't know anything about the book, which is why people do book tours. But his assumptions are so interesting that his platform is the basic platform, and hers is like this option. And let's let her talk a little bit, see how she answers this.
you can walk with me through most of the book, and then I tell you where you might get off. Much of this is empirical, right? There's a reason I overlap a lot with Caroline Criado Perez, who writes about the ways that men and women differ physically, and then the built world, when built to a male norm, doesn't serve women. The most empirical and kind of unarguable fact in the book is that pregnancy is a serious asymmetry between men and women that really doesn't admit to the nature versus nurture discussion. So are women different than men? Yes, I think a secular reader can come with me that far on those questions. Where the challenge is, and where it is informed by my Christian beliefs, is, does that mean women suck? No. I say this from two traditions. The tradition I grew up with as an atheist feminist, from a mom who certainly didn't believe that asking for justice for women and acknowledging women could differ from men meant conceding that women were lesser than men. So my whole life, I have never seen a difference between men and women as frightening evidence that women are lesser persons. That's true. And that's true before I was a Christian. As a Christian, I have a firmer ground for believing that. Um, but I think that is the place where people diverge. I make this whole case that it is a brute fact that we are dependent. And if you don't believe me, you can look at a baby for a few minutes and think about what they'd do if you'd walked away. And then remember, you were once a baby. So every single person has at least one period of dependency in their life. I argue that persists or crops up again and again, even if you are so lucky as to be hit by a bus and instantly killed when you're a 35-year-old male, so you skip out on the dying. You still started as a baby. The value judgment is that this is not a bad thing about you. But if you come with me on the empirical part and agree this is all true about human beings and get off at the moral part, I'm worried about where you land. But I think we get a good picture of it in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the other parts where I think a secular reader or a non-religious reader, or even sort of I don't know, average sort of progressive reader might get off is places where you suggest that technologies or tools for sort of limiting dependence are actually not a good thing. Suggesting that, you know, babies, unborn children are dependent on their mothers. It's like not really fair to mothers. So, many feminists say, well, so, abortion should be legal. Or actually, this idea of, if not surrogacy, sort of like external wombs, like that would actually be a helpful technology for helping women sort of adapt themselves to a workplace that isn't perfectly suited for them, but this like might make their lives easier in some other way. Um, it, I mean, it throughout the book, you are against sort of those interventions. And that seems like a very specific.
Now, what's interesting is, of course, there's this duplicitous element of, oh, regular life is valueless, so you can just do what you want. But, oh, no, we have values, and so these things are privileged. And this is where the Christian nationalism conversation is going to get very interesting, because part of the assumption of things like human rights, part of the reason that these sort of became default assumptions untethered from what people recognize and identify as a religion, is that they were simply so pervasive, they just became assumed. Because why should the nation care about anything? Isn't it just up to the will of the Congress? Is Congress itself beholden to something? Now, in the United States, this tends to come through the legislative system, and the voters then get to vote their preferences. So if you want a society in which, because if you look at Roe v. Wade had this line of basically, well, when is viability? When is the child viable? Well, 10 days out, is the child viable? The child is still dependent on its mother 10 days out, but it can be dependent on another mother. And the more we go down there, the more we realize, yeah, but with a wound. And so part of the reason we're having this conversation now is we're sort of trying to figure out how to sort this out in a pluralistic society. And so Leah Labresco Sargent and her arguments, I mean, she's going to make arguments of influence that say, you might not maintain all of the beliefs that I have, but I'm going to leverage assumptions that you have, which, whether or not you recognize, they've been inherited from Christianity. And of course, one of Tom Holland's anxieties, why he wrote the book, was, well, when you take those things away, will these ideas about human rights really matter, or will everything just sort of get into expedience? Now, I've just started reading, I was reading Christopher Clark's book Sleepwalkers, which is sort of the march up to the First World War. And I'm also very interested again in 19th century history because so much of what happens, so you get sort of the advent of public republicanism in the end of the 18th century, 1776, Declaration of Independence, the American Constitution, the French Revolution. So you get the advent of republicanism, and Europe in the 18th century starts to adopt, constitutions, parliaments, and that wave begins to go through Europe. But also what arises in the 19th century in Europe is socialism. It's helpful to remember that, Nazism is National Socialism. So this idea of socialism comes into the culture. And what on earth do we mean by socialism? I'm not going to get down into that word too far. But when I started the book, I was a little bit surprised by the long preamble that the book has. Because the first, at least an audiobook, the first chapter of the book is like 2.5 hours long, which is like, well, that's a long chapter. And then he starts by talking about really issues that arise. They started to arise in the 18th century, but they really get going in the 19th century, where you have industrialization, urbanization. You've got the beginning of these things, but you don't have other things that we tend to take for granted now, like a lot of food security. And you have all of these books getting written, and statistics is now in force, and sociology is beginning. And you have all of these class structures. The middle class is really beginning to grow, but there's a tremendous amount of poor. I thought about it. I thought about Paul Kingsnorth's work a lot in this book because he talks about things like, getting rid of the commons. And Christopher Clark actually talks about this stuff. Why first of all, you had population growth, and then you'd have food insecurity. You had potato blight and other bad harvests. And then you had all of these other new intermediate structures that weren't really working yet. And you had this in the context mostly of absolute monarchies, because part of what happens in the 18th and 19th century is while you have republicanism sort of growing, you also sort of have these absolute monarchies that increasingly say, we answer directly to God. It's God, me, and then I tell you what to do. And of course, you get different monarchs in there. But you have this old style of, the obligation of the nobility towards the masses. And it's right in the crux of the transition to a new style where you have things like wage labor, you have child labor, you have women's labor, you have urbanization, people fleeing the countryside. Again, they're fleeing the countryside because they want to eat and because there are opportunities in the city that they know they're not going to get in the countryside. So you have urbanization. He actually begins on the coast of France, where the English and their navy the English and their navy, they basically cut out the African slave trade. And so the towns in France that had a lot of economic activity because of the African slave trade are now suffering. And the poorest in those towns are living in absolute squalor. And he goes into a fair amount of detail on these issues. Now, the reason he's doing all of this is because what happens in 1848 and 1849 are these waves of revolutions that happen in Europe. And of course, the Pope has to flee Rome. Austria totters a bit, but in many cases, they were able to sort of, some cases brutally put down the rebellion. In other cases, make some accommodations. But this really gets things moving. And of course, then by the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, you're going to have the communist revolution. And that really puts sort of the fear into everyone, because the communist revolution is such a stark overturning of the old order. But all of the institutions are scrambling to try to adjust. And of course, in some ways, the Catholic Church is really struggling to adjust. And that sort of sets up what will happen at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, where on one hand, they begin to say, yeah, we should pay attention to the workers because the Bible does talk about importance of the poor, but yet they weren't able to deliver on the goods in the papal states. And so what you have is really, in some ways, an acceleration of the machine. And there are all these trade-offs with that. In so many cases, they had to do it because hungry people, there's all this talk right now in the news about SNAP, and I'm not going to make this a political thing, but I'll tell you, hungry people have not a lot left to lose, and they tend to destroy things. And so, one of the things that governments often try to do just for their own self-interest is to, make sure people at least have food. Because if people have food, they have something to live for, because they have a pretty reasonable chance that they'll see tomorrow. I was also thinking about this because I was watching a video on these massive data centers that are going in, and often in Indiana, taking incredible amounts of electricity and water. And, it leads me to this whole question of governments really do try to pacify and manage the masses. And what I think we're going to see happen really with AI is not only is it in the government's interest to pacify the masses with affordable food. Part of the reason that the government managed the airways for the television set was manage the masses through the television set. If you go into a nursing home, one of the things that's almost ubiquitous is the noise from daytime TV. My guess is that part of what we're going to see deployed is AI on a massive scale to manage inconvenient people. I already mentioned in a video that, school teachers are noticing not basically anxiety about being cut off from mom, but anxiety about being cut off from their iPad. And we're going to see, the argument in this conversation was, well, it's just a whole lot more convenient if, surrogacy that comes in, if someone else can carry that baby and have the risk and stretch marks and all of that to give birth to the baby, and then I'll just get it. But then maybe, it isn't the right time, or maybe it isn't, doesn't have all the features I want. So maybe I'll wait for another model, and babies become these little consumer items. And then, well, you think it's inconvenient carrying that baby for 9 months. Well, try raising them for 18 years. And that's on both parents. Well, I'll just give them an iPad, or I'll just hook them up to the AI. And the AI will perfectly watch the interaction. Oh, you didn't like this video? Try this video. Oh, you didn't like that music? Try this music. Oh, you didn't like this story? Try that story. How about another one of these stories? How about another one of these stories? On and on and on and on. And then we can do that for education too, because I know that's what the plans are. Teachers are very expensive. So if you can eliminate teachers and put all those kids in schools, all in front of computers, all powered by AI, and of course, the I reset the filter, so hopefully we won't have any dropped sound in this video. that's where this is going to go. And we're going to see this big separation in society. And this is going to look religious because it's going to be the religious people. And it's probably going to be all the religious people. It's going to be like most of the Christians and a lot of the Jews and some of the Muslims, and who are going to say, no, I'm going to raise my baby myself. I'm going to have a relationship with my child. And education is not putting this child in front of a computer and just having AI do all the education. Right now, there was actually a talk about this at the last ARC, where it was this massive the tech industry is looking for massive contracts from states for public education. And states are looking at it because it's like, yeah, that's a lot of money to spend for the AI, but you know what costs more? Teachers. And so if we can basically put kids in school and have them, well, we'll make what's on the screen and the keyboard fun. We'll gamify it, and we'll just have them sitting there and we'll be playing a game. And well, you can't touch anybody at school. No tag, no dodgeball, none of that. No touching. Nobody can touch you. And but you can touch a keyboard. So on one hand, yeah, I think governments are going to continue to try to pacify people. And they didn't have that technology in the 19th century. We're definitely going to have it in the 21st. But what we are going to be is not connected to each other. What's the name of her book? Dependence. But connected up to the AI. And then, if someone gets bored with it, oh, well, you don't even have to call a hotline. You just get to a chat. Would you like the I'm depressed and I want to live, or I'm depressed and I want to end it line? And, Uber Maid, come right up and we'll take care of that for you. All right, that's enough of this. Leave a comment.